Hello there, tankers and tankettes. This is Iron Lord Mink coming at you a very special episode today. This episode is going to be in regard to a new series I'm going to be starting called Steel Beasts Legends at War. And today's episode is going to be specifically focusing on the M4 Sherman medium tank, perhaps the backbone of the Allied forces during World War II. Some would say it was the tank that won us the war, and in general, a very well-known vehicle. Now, before I begin and get actually into the story of the M4 Sherman, as it were, I'd like to throw a special thank you to YouTube channels such as Blitzkrieg and Panzer Picture for putting this stock footage out there for me to use in the making of this video to make it as good as I hope it will eventually be. So big thank you to them. I will put links to any content or channels I use in this video below in the description for you guys to check out, but in the meantime, yes, get into things. So as I said, the M4 Sherman, it was pretty much the mainstay vehicle of the Allied forces in World War II. It served pretty much on every front, including the South Pacific in battles as well known as Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and even served on the Eastern Front with the Soviets via Lend-Lease, and of course in North Africa and Western Europe with the Allied forces. Now, the actual story of the M4 Sherman begins following the after events of the Battle of France, where the American US forces, so US armed forces, were extremely shocked, as were most nations, in regards to the speed of which Germany was able to overrun France, mainly with their direct blitzkrieg attack through, of course, the Ardennes, which separated both British and French forces within France and Belgium from one another, which allowed them to be encircled and the divisions fortunately destroyed. Though many fortunately were able to escape because of operations such as Operation Dynamo and the Dunkirk evacuation, among others. Unfortunately, many men were actually lost or became prisoners because of that blitzkrieg attack, as France effectively capitulated within only 8 weeks because of the speed and ferocity of the German blitzkrieg. Now, following after that event, of course, France ended up capitulating. The three French forces did continue to fight on, and Britain unfortunately had to leave pretty much all of its equipment behind at Dunkirk, which meant any new equipment had to go to the British Army first, meaning they couldn't supply their allies in New Zealand, Australia, and of course Canada. So what ended up happening was, of course, Britain ended up relying on Lend-Lease from the US forces, which was essentially a signed agreement from around late 1940 onwards, where America would split any new equipment it's built or developed, such as again the M4 Sherman as mentioned in this video, and among others, among its own armed forces and the armed forces of the Allies and the Greater Commonwealth. Now, from the Americans' perspective, after what they saw was this massive blitzkrieg tank attack, which pretty much overran anything in front of it, is they found that the overall tank forces were very underdeveloped, with their main tank, the main medium tank, being the M2 medium, which was a fairly tall vehicle with a 37mm gun, very lightly armoured. In fact, it was perhaps no better than the M2 light tank and the M3 Stuart, which by this point, due to the escalation of the war in North Africa, were being sent to the British via Lend-Lease. So what ended up happening was the US forces put in basically a quick stopgap measure to try and produce a tank as quickly as possible, building what would become the M3 Lee, or the M3 Grant as it was known in British service, with the only real difference being the turrets, where the turret on the M3 Grant was larger because it had a bustle in it at the back for the radio, and it was also one crew member short compared to the 7-man crew of the M3 Lee. Now, the M3 Lee / Grant was pretty much developed as quickly as it possibly could, seeing mass production throughout 1940 and eventually making its way to Allied forces as early as 1941. Though at this time America wasn't involved in the conflict, or the Great Conflict of World War II, it would later find itself dragged into it because, of course, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, in regards to the M3 Lee, as I said, it was a stopgap tank. It wasn't really designed to be the main battle tank, effectively, of Allied forces. It was mainly just there to be just a vehicle that was available to fulfill Lend-Lease requirements and to, of course, supplement the US Army in regards to tanks and availability, to ensure that if they were involved in the conflict, they would be prepared, obviously, to do so. Now, the M3 Lee had a number of flaws, mainly being extremely tall, having a large crew unnecessarily, and the fact it had riveted armor, though it did have a number of actual benefits that made it extremely useful for the war in the desert before the what would eventually become the M4A1 would arrive. So the main benefits of the M3 Lee / Grant would have been the 75mm cannon. Now, this cannon was absolutely perfect for what would become the situation in the Desert War. Now, while the British specifically did not want the Lee, we wanted anything but, because we saw the flaws in regards to its design. Unfortunately, because of what happened after Dunkirk, the fact that we were still trying to rebuild our armed forces, and it was the only real tank available other than M3 Stuarts and then the M2 light tanks that the Americans had available to give us via Lend-Lease, it was something that we just again had to accept, and we did have to deploy it as much as we would have preferred something to be better than the Lee. But though when it did find its way into the North Africa campaign, it was well liked by its crews, generally because of that 75mm main gun, though it did have a 37mm in the turret, which did also find its some use as well on occasion. But that 75mm gun really made the Lee a success, because it was the first time the Allied forces had a gun on a tank with parity to what the Axis were fielding with the Panzer III Ls with the 50mm gun, and would later become the Panzer IV F2 with the 75mm L43 cannon, which were very capable anti-tank guns, which practically outranged anything we had at the time before these introductions, specifically looking at the M3 Stuarts with their 37mm gun and the 40mm gun on many of the other British tanks, such as the Matilda, the early Crusaders before the Mark III, and of course other tanks such as the Valentine, and even the very initial designs of the Churchill, such as the Churchill Mark I and the Mark II. As for the first time, that 75mm gun, not only did it have near parity in terms of combat range, it also had a really effective HE shell, which meant dealing with fortifications was a hell of a lot easier than using a 40mm gun with HE, which even when the HE was fielded, which was pretty much never was in British service, it's effectively like throwing a hand grenade at a bunker and it wouldn't really do anything. So the fact we had that gun was a major step forward in terms of design, and eventually with America's entry in the war in 1942, we would see more types of vehicles available, such as, of course, the M4 Sherman, among others, which again, when it came to service, were an absolute fantastic vehicle that, again, Allied forces couldn't really get enough of. In fact, when the Sherman was introduced into service and when it was first seen on the battlefields of North Africa, I believe even Albert Speer, who was the Nazi Germany's head armaments organizer, said pretty much the M4 Sherman is the best tank in the world. Now, the M4 Sherman did have its problems, granted. When it was initially deployed, I mean, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, as it were. It did have a number of issues which would later be ironed out, such as the way the ammo was stowed in regards to it being sponsor storage, so it's just stored on the sides. It didn't really have any sort of a protection, so it meant if the shells were hit, it could burst into flames or cause an explosion within the vehicle, which is not good, one for crew survivability or the actual combat effectiveness of the vehicle. Though American ammunition, it did have a tendency to more fizzle than anything, so it didn't immediately burst into flames or explode, which was at least at least a little bit of reassurance. But it did lead the Sherman to having a 80% burn rate in regards to any time a Sherman was hit. It was pretty much 80% likely to burst into flames. Now, this probably contributed to many of the myths regarding the Sherman, such as it, being nicknamed Tommy Cooker or Wonson or any of these sort of things, where it was seen as something that burst into flames instantly because it used petrol. Though again, that's not necessarily true, because various German tanks used petrol, and the main reason for the fires was, of course, the ammunition. Though, like I say, that was something that was later rectified. Now, I'm going to show you a quick clip from the History Channel regarding this Sherman, and I'm going to break it down for you afterwards. And here we go.
Sherman tanks, remembered by their designers for speed and agility, and by their crews for being the right tanks for the wrong war. How many times have you seen images like this from film shot during World War II? Powerful American Sherman tanks rolling across the European countryside, delivering firepower to Allied ground troops where it was needed most.
The Sherman tank's weight class was somewhere between a light tank, which was small, and a heavy tank, was a big monster. It was designed to go over military bridges. It was designed to fit on railroad cars. It was designed for easy transportation. It was designed for automotive reliability.
When the decision was made to invade Europe, General George S. Patton himself selected the Sherman as his tank of choice.
He said, we don't need a heavy tank. We can win the war with this medium tank. Make as many of those as you can.
Sherman tanks rolled off American assembly lines by the thousands, nearly 50,000 total. When they reached Europe, 3 to 5 man tank crews immediately took them into battle. The image of the approaching Shermans became a myth-like representation of the invincibility of America's war machine. But those who actually fought it and maintained the Sherman tanks claimed the invincibility was a myth. And as far as their design for World War II was concerned, the tanks were engineering disasters.
So the reason I show that clip is because it kind of highlights all the sort of myths and the kind of response most people have in regards to Sherman, where it's apparently this disastrous, horrible vehicle that is liable to get its crew killed, which is again way far enough from the truth. Now, I also just showed a little bit a quick clip there from the chieftain or Nick Moran's pretty much his busting American armor myths, which I'm going to link as well in the description because it is really handy, and it pretty much goes for everything way better than I can in regards to debunking myths in regards to American World War II armor. Though, in regards to the History Channel, and when it showed off the Sherman being a disaster, I believe it's mainly due to the reputation of a book called Death Traps, which pretty much calls out the Sherman for all its flaws. Though in regards to that book itself, while it is a good read and it is definitely recommended if you are interested in the subject, again, always sort of fact check what you read, because although it was written by some who served in World War II, a man called Belton Cooper, who was a maintenance captain who served alongside a Sherman unit. The problem is, he as someone who worked within the maintenance unit, the sort of people who would maintain and repair those damaged Shermans that may have, unfortunately taken some severe casualties. Of course, that can really cloud some perspective, though. Not to sort of say anything real against him. It's just like I say, it's just one of those things. If you are serving in a conflict and you do only really see the one side of things with burnt out wrecks, etc., of course it's going to cloud your perspective. But like I say, I would definitely recommend you read if you're interested in the subject, and just sort of just to sort of evaluate the effectiveness of the Sherman. But like I say, with the Sherman's flaws, its only real main flaws were, like I say, the way the ammo was stored, which was fixed, and like I say, even when it did before it was fixed and it had an 80% burn rate, it was pretty much no different to any other tank that you would see on a battlefield, especially like German vehicles pretty much had the same problem. And in regards to the Sherman as well, the only other issues that really come to mind are the pretty much the 75mm gun, though as early as 1942, before Americans even get involved in North Africa, they're already planning on upgrading that gun to a 76mm. They already tried twice by that point, and in fact before the project is pretty much cancelled in like mid 43, but then revived soon after, where they first try to fit a 3-inch gun to the turret, which is the same anti-tank gun you would have seen in something like a Wolverine or even a the M6 heavy tank. However, that gun is far too heavy and far too big to fit inside the turret, so it's pretty much dropped straight away. And then they also try the 76mm gun as well. However, with that gun, it had the same sort of problem where with the early Sherman turrets, it was pretty much too cramped and too crowded. And considering for 1942, this is before you really see the big cats deployed, which happens later on in the year, going into 1943 with the Tiger, and of course the Panther, which becomes, a fairly common sight from around August 1943 onwards. The 75mm gun at this point is still good enough. It's still capable of dealing with pretty much the majority of German armour. It's still capable of dealing with infantry and soft targets like trucks, anti-tank guns, which was pretty much the primary target you would have been facing anyway, given that the lack of real production when it comes to German vehicles. Though going on to the Sherman, in fact, like I say, it lacked that Lotus crew hatch, did again, hamper survivability, though it was something that was rectified fairly quickly. When people say the Sherman was a death trap, like I say, it's so far from the truth, because if we actually look at American Sherman crew casualties, and so this was specifically US forces, the total casualties, including injuries and deaths, was only 3%. Only 3% of crew members that served the Shermans died. So, I mean, if I had the choice of serving any tank, I would choose to be serving the Sherman, just because of, like, say, it's a reliable tank. It hardly ever broke down, and when it did, because of the way American mass production worked, there was always spare parts available for it. The second thing as well, like I say, the protection was usually good enough, and even though people say, well, the Tiger is thicker armor, and well, the Panther's way better protected, etc. Well, that's true. However, just more looking at things in general, where the average Sherman tank tended to have about 3.7 inches of effective armor, around basically 75 to 90mm. Though you did get the heavier assault Shermans like the M4 A3E2 Jumbo, which did see service in 1944 onwards, though in limited amounts in small units. But in regards to the Sherman itself and its protection, well, like I say, it was fairly adequately protected. Like, you couldn't really fault it, and where later modifications would see a pleat armor added, just to toughen up the hide a bit, and of course, thicker gunmetal armor when the Sherman was eventually upgraded in American service with the T-23 turret, which then saw the Sherman being able to actually fit the 76mm without any compromises to crew ergonomics. You found yourself, you have a vehicle that is really well balanced, both in terms of firepower, in terms of protection, and of course its mobility, where its mobility was probably the main key feature, where it's been able to go anywhere between 40 to 48 kilometers in a straight line. The Sherman also had an additional great features, and that was the gyro stabilizer, which pretty much meant while it couldn't fully fire on the move, it did help keep the guns stabilized. So when it came to what was known as stop and pop tactics, where you'd say drive forward, you stop, you fire, and then you pull back, etc., maybe on the ridge line, it was an absolutely perfect vehicle for that sort of tactic, that sort of employment. And when, of course, the 75mm gun was found to be getting a little late in the tooth, going into 1943 with battles in Italy, etc., where the Panther was becoming more available. Though American intelligence thought the Panther would be basically like the Tiger, it'd be a limited production vehicle that would really be seen. You did see the 76mm gun begin to be introduced, though it wasn't deployed in Normandy until well after again, the beachhead had been secured, at which point, you're pretty much nearly pushing into Germany. So that was pretty much a major flaw. Again, it's a sort of oversight by US Army Command, but when you consider that the 75mm gun, even up until that point, was still able to knock out Panthers and Tigers, because crews would get a little creative, like by, say, firing just loads of HE until you eventually destroy the Tiger by concussing the crew and or just damaging elements of the vehicle, like say a mobility kill where you knock out the tracks, etc. Or in the case of the Panther, where Canadian tank crews in Italy would actually fire out the shot trap on the Panther's mantlet, allowing the shell to bounce pretty much from the mantlet down into the hull and knocking out the vehicle that way. Or they would fire shells at the ground at an angle so that they would bounce into the lower plates and knock out the transmission and final drives of the Panther and then potentially setting it on fire. The crews would always find a way to make the 75mm work, which is partially probably why even many commanders on the ground, when they were given the option to take the 76, sort of refused it initially, until again you get those later battles where the Panther becomes more of a presence on the World War II battlefield, which is again leading to Normandy itself. Partially the reason why the Firefly has so much fame regarding it, as the Firefly, well, rather than waiting to get 76mm, which is perfect and doesn't, you don't have to sacrifice ergonomics, etc. The Firefly pretty much was a quick and dirty conversion of the Sherman by British tank industry to retrofit the Sherman with a 76.2mm gun, or the 17-pounder, which had extremely high penetration with an armored piercing ballistic cap round, around 150mm penetration at 1500 meters, basically meaning it could practically destroy a Panther at extreme range, including Tiger ones, and with its Sabre rounds, it had about 220mm of penetration at that extreme range as well, which pretty much made it meant even when Tiger 2 was introduced, that 17-pounder was able of knocking out Tiger 2's frontally, though with the Sabre rounds they did have flaws, specifically in regards to stability, which is why piercing ballistic cap was still the primary round used and would typically be used within about an engagement range of around 500 meters to just guarantee the maximum possible penetration and damage to enemy vehicles. The 76, on the other hand, while it didn't have as great penetration, as I said, it didn't sacrifice ergonomics in regards to the vehicle, and it was a much more sort of competent design, and with the development of HVAP rounds, it pretty much could nearly match the 17-pounder performance at those extreme ranges, where with HVAP it had about 143mm of penetration at 1500 meters, and then with about 100 meters it was around 240mm of penetration, which pretty much meant, again, even with 76mm HVAP, it was able to deal with pretty much everything that you would find on a World War II battlefield, and which pretty much meant that even when Pershing was starting to see deduction and stopgap measures of, say, again trying to fit a Pershing turret with a 90mm gun on the Sherman, were pretty much abandoned immediately because the 76mm HVAP was that effective. Though we did see a number of conversions post-war in regards to Shermans with other nations, France most well known of which was with the SA-50 Sherman and the Sherman FL-10, which was a Sherman pretty much refitted with a AMX-13 turret and, like say, that SA-50 gun in an auto-loading mount, and the Sherman SA-50 was pretty much just, again, the same thing, though just with, again, a single shot variation of that gun in the standard turret, with the 75mm SA-50 gun pretty much being a French sort of post-war pretty much improvement over the 75mm L70, which we found on the Panther tank, which was again an absolutely devastating anti-tank weapon. And like I say, following the war, even with other countries like Israel well known for deploying the M50 and M51 Super Shermans, were able to do some crazy things with it, amounting a 105mm. And one can say, like, again, when you look back at these documentaries, these other videos and things where people say, oh, the Sherman was a useless vehicle, it was absolutely horrible, and etc., you can't really say the Sherman's horrible when it was one of the few vehicles, in fact the only vehicle in World War II to serve on practically every front, from North Africa through to the South Pacific, to the Eastern Front of the Soviet Union via Lend-Lease, and of course in Western Europe, during the battles for Normandy and the eventual push into Germany. So, if it was so bad, why were 50,000 of them built in the first place? Surely you would have tried to build something better. And why is it that it pretty much served on every front with a distinctive combat record where, even Soviet crews, which, again, post-war may have said, oh, the vehicle is terrible just because, Soviet propaganda and all that, but even Soviet crews found great utility in the vehicle, where it was pretty much able to do everything they needed it to do. And like I say, even in Korea, in the Korean War, where the M26 Pershing at this point in time would have been effectively the main battle tank of the American forces. Again, it was a vehicle that pretty much edged its way into conflict just at the tail end of World War II, though it did have a number of flaws in regards to its transmission engine, including its weight as well, only to gain a little bit more, was slightly more potent as a tank gun in the form of the 19mm, which wasn't really that great anyway to begin with, at least early on, before later ammunition, and then it was later redesigned to become more capable. During Korea, in fact, the M26 Pershing was effectively replaced by the Sherman because the Sherman was just more reliable, it was lighter, so it was easy to transport, only weighing 30 tons, which is pretty much the main design goal behind the Sherman. And in regards to that, it was still capable of quickly and easily knocking out potential T-34-85s that you would engage. And the same could be said in regards to the 6-Day War with Israel, where Israel were using Sherman SA-50s, the M51 Super Shermans, even a few older Sherman 76s, and were easily able to take out, again, the Soviet armour that the Syrians, Egyptians, etc. were fielding. So there's a lot to say about the Sherman and its versatility, which is perhaps the best reason to keep the Sherman around. It was probably the best tank built during World War II for one reason alone, and that was its modularity. It was so easy to upgrade. You could, replace the gun. You could, give it all sorts of different engines. There was about 3 or so different variants of just different engines, like the Chrysler Multi-Bank, the Ford GAA engine, etc. And it was just an amazing vehicle for that versatility, where it could pretty much meet every battlefield need the Allies threw at it. And like I say, in my view, the Sherman was probably, if there was a contender for best tank of World War II, though it really can't be said, there was a best tank, because again, every tank that was built to the battlefield needs, a specific nation's doctrine. But in regards to the Sherman, I would say if there was a contender for the best tank in World War II, it definitely fits it, and I'm just really glad that the tank doesn't get as much hate as it used to because of those really bad documentaries that went around. But that's pretty much it. So like I say, that's pretty much the end of the video, just talking about the M4 Sherman, bit about its history, and like I say, I really hope you enjoy. Again, I'm going to be trying to make this a series. I'm going to link things down in the description below if you're interested, if you want to find out a bit more about the Sherman. But other than that though, thank you very much for watching. Take care, and hope you enjoy, and keep on tanking, folks.